Good afternoon, and welcome to the February webinar presented by the Recruitment, Training, and Support Center at the Federation for Children with Special Needs. My name is Janie Greco, and I am the Training and Support Specialist for RTSC. Our presenter today is Ashley Coates, Information Specialist for the Parent Training and Information Center, who coordinates the call center here at the Federation. Our technical producer today is Emily Gaudet. If you are interested in learning more about the Federation, please go to our website at fcn.org and explore all the different programs and training opportunities. Our webinar today is being recorded and will be available on the Federation's YouTube channel at youtube.com/FCSN videos. If you are viewing the webinar, please type your questions into the toolbox and we will answer them as time allows. Also, feel free to chat amongst yourself as other people in the audience ask questions in the toolbox. It makes for an engaging hour. Thank you and welcome, Ashley.
Hi, Janie. Thank you for having me.
Are you ready to go?
Oh, yeah.
All righty. Let's go.
Great. So today we are going to talk a little bit about discipline in special education. And so just to outline a little bit about what you can expect in the workshop, we'll talk about the school handbook and its function and the importance of it. We'll talk about a functional behavior analysis. We're also going to touch a little bit on restraint, suspension, and the new federal and state initiatives, the importance and help you understand the manifestation determination review, and then we'll talk a little bit about guns, drugs, and serious bodily harm, which Janie refers to as the 3 deadly sins. And then we'll focus on interim alternative placements and the due process so that you can understand what to do when things aren't going well. So there's a lot of vocabulary that we have to be considerate of when we talk about this, and sometimes in special education we tend to use lots of abbreviations. So I want to make sure that everybody understands what we're talking about when we say FBA or a BCBA. Behavior Intervention Plan we'll refer to as a BIP. Present levels of education performance, that's something that you'll see in your student's IEP, and that's often referred to as a PLEP. And then just to be thinking about the code of conduct found in your student handbook, and then to understand what restraint means, what suspension is, detention, manifestation determination, serious bodily harm, and then an interim alternate placement, which you might also hear as a 45-day placement. And we talk a little bit about the brain. So when we're talking about that, we think about external and internal stimuli. So one of the things that I think we need to talk about right from the beginning is the importance of the school handbook. So each school is going to have their own handbook, and that's given out to your students at the beginning of the year. And what that contains is your code of conduct. So that's for all students that are in the district, and it really talks about what the expectations are for behavior from the students, and then also what to happen if the rules are broken, which is some of the things that we worry about when we're thinking about discipline. So most of the time, your district and then sometimes individual schools and buildings are going to have their own rules. So oftentimes if you're transitioning from elementary school or to middle school, you'll want to check and see if the code of conduct has changed. Most of the time that code of conduct is available on your school's website, so that's a great place to check. But if not, if you can't find it on the website, you can certainly request one from the school. And for those of us that have kiddos with some behavior or discipline issues, I would definitely recommend keeping a copy of that handbook handy. So one of my favorite quotes, and something that I've heard a lot about at working with kids for as long as I have, is that children do well if they can, and if they can't, then it's up to an adult to figure out why. So Ross Greene is the author of The Explosive Child, which if you haven't read that book, I would hop on Amazon right now and order it, because it really has been such a great resource for me and for a lot of the people that I work with. So I would definitely recommend taking a look at that. We're going to talk a little bit about behavior and how behavior sometimes results in discipline. So I mentioned before that we want to make sure we're studying the school handbook with our student in mind. So we should really be considering how the information presented in the handbook is going to impact your son or daughter or your SESP student, because a lot of times the handbook is written really for your typical student. And so if our students have some behaviors that maybe are not typical, we want to be sure that we're thinking about how that is going to impact them when it comes to discipline. So for instance, if their disability is going to make it difficult for them to follow the rules, you need to put it in the IEP. And I will talk a lot about the IEP and the importance of it as a legal document, because that's your contract with the school to make sure that everything that you need for your son or daughter is being met. So, for instance, the example we give on the slide is that if the rule is keep your hands to yourself and it's a problem for your student, we want to make sure that we're bringing that to the team and including it in the IEP, and we're really thinking about it as a goal or objective, because we want to make sure that behaviors are included in the IEP so that we can know that educators and the team there is really working on making things successful for the student. So, I have an example. I manage the call center here at the Federation, so I hear an awful lot about students who have, had some difficulty following the rules or what to do when they do something they're not supposed to. So, an example of that could be a student who struggles with impulsive behaviors. So one of the things that I always think about is that big, shiny, red fire alarm. And that, to me, it might as well just say pull me on it, which I think some of them actually do. But for students who have a hard time with that, we have to make sure that they're understanding the consequences. So, for instance, in the school handbook, it may clearly outline, and I know a lot of them do, that if you pull the fire alarm, you can be expelled from the school. So it's a danger to others. It causes, some mass hysteria sometimes, but we want to make sure that students understand, or that if that's likely, that we're putting supports in place for them. So maybe it has to do with where they are in line, or maybe it's doing some training with them to understand the whole process of what happens when we pull a fire alarm. Beyond the big sound, what does it look like after that? So I think that when we start thinking about that, we also have to remember that we need to document and save all of our behavior-related information with the school. So I don't know if you guys have attended webinars or trainings about the importance of being organized in special education, but what it really comes down to is that there is a lot of stuff. And especially when it comes to behavior and discipline, we want to make sure that we're keeping track of our stuff and that we know what to do and where to go if we need to have a meeting or we need to bring some, documentation or evidence of things that have been going on. So I think when we think about discipline, we think about bad behavior, and bad behavior is what results in discipline. And so when we're looking at behavior, we're thinking about behavioral responses being actions or reactions of a person in response to external or internal stimuli. Ooh, that's a tricky word. So when we're talking about external and internal stimuli, I mean things like it could be noises in the room, it could be somebody else bugging you, or having another, kiddo who's doing something that's bothering you. It could be internal stimuli. So for kids that have maybe some sensory issues or things like that, you want to be considerate about the fact that behavior is going to be a form of communication, and they're trying to tell you something. So behavior, when we say that, it means it can be big and bold, which is, if you've ever seen, which I'm sure you guys haven't, but if you've ever seen a kid have a tantrum before, that would be what I would think about as big and bold. Or it could be quiet and withdrawn. So if your student is usually fairly outgoing and they're kind of, sulking, or they're not talking, or things like that, I think it's important to notice when there's a change in behavior, because kids typically have, a temperament, and if they're straying from that, we want to know what it is that's going on for them. And then children need others to understand how they're communicating with you. So for kiddos who talk just like you and I, using our voices, it's making sure that they feel heard, like someone's listening to what they have to say. But it could also be kids want people to know that if I'm, being quiet and withdrawn, I don't want someone to talk to me, or I don't want, a whole lot of attention, or maybe they do. Maybe that's them reaching out and asking for that. So I think we need to think about behavior from a developmental perspective. And a lot of times we hear people talk about behavior and kids who have, negative behaviors as being non-compliant, or if you've ever heard someone say, that kid just needs more structure, more discipline, or more things like that. But I really want us to think about behavior today from a developmental perspective. And what that's going to look like is that kiddos are going to be delayed in the development of skills. So it's not that they're, strictly being non-compliant. It's not that they're not willing to comply with what it is that you're talking about. It's sometimes they don't have the skills to do that. And so what we're talking about here is skills like flexibility and adaptability, frustration, tolerance, or if they have a significant difficulty applying these skills when they're needed most. So one of the things that I think is interesting is if you think about the last time that you were frustrated, maybe you were sitting in traffic, or maybe you were in the grocery store and you were stuck behind somebody who was super slow and using coupons, and you're really frustrated. And is that your typical behavior? Is your temperament where it would usually be at that point? And I'm not sure, at least for me, that it is. I think I call it kind of angry Ashley that comes out sometimes when it's like that, and it's not my usual behavior, but it's the fact that sometimes when you're in that place, you lose the skills to, be patient, to relax, to take deep breaths, all of the things that we tell kids to do. And so really we want to make sure that we're thinking about it being a lack of skill, not a lack of motivation, not non-compliance. And I think that there's a big difference between when we look at a child's inflexible or explosive behavior or non-compliant behavior as the result of a brain-based failure to progress developmentally, and viewing it as planned, intentional, and purposeful. So we definitely are going to look at that child differently if we're thinking about lacking skills rather than lacking motivation. And I think that when we think about, delays in development, that we can really think about this as a skill that needs to be taught and a skill that needs to be focused on for a lot of kids. It doesn't always come naturally. And Janie and I, we were talking about this. We were talking about how a lot of the kids that we are talking about in our presentation today who have had a history of trauma, and how that trauma can cause a shutdown in skills. So Janie, I don't know if you have any expert background that you want to give there on how that happens, how trauma impacts a lack of the development of the skills that we're talking about for behavior.
Sure. I think one of the main things about kids with trauma is that they don't have the scaffolding of their cognition that typical kids would have. And one of the first things that a very young infant learns, and even they're thinking now in utero, is that they learn cause and effect. And that means that if they have a behavior, whether it's crying or laughing or focusing on the mom, that a typical reaction will create that cause-effect learning. But for kids who have been traumatized and are cribbed or kept in high chairs all day and don't have that one-on-one with a parent or a caregiver, that early skill is never actually learned. And so I think a lot of our behaviors, in fact, an applied behavioral analyst would say all behaviors are A plus B plus E equals C, which means that the antecedent comes before the behavior, and what the reaction is after the behavior is the consequence, whether it be negative or positive. So if you don't have that simple formula in your head, it takes a long time to teach it, and it's not taught overnight. It's really a long-term process. And anybody who's tried to explain to a kid with trauma or given them consequences, whether they're positive or negative, that means either a star chart or a loss of a privilege, knows that you can probably do that 1,000 times and they still have difficulty learning it.
I think that's a great point, Janie, and I think we also think about that as the cause and effect relationship. So these kids just don't have it. They can't see, if I do this, then this is what's going to happen. And it could be physical behavior. So like if I push this, plant stand over, the plant's going to fall over, the dirt's going to get all over the floor, and then someone's going to have to clean it up. So they might know what's going to happen right after that, and that might be why they do it, because pushing over plants seems like fun, but it's not fun if you're the one with the broom who has to clean it up or the vacuum afterwards. So I think we have to kind of think about it in that setting, that they can't see the long-term effects of some of the things that they're doing, or even in the short term they can't see them. And so we want to try and catch these kids before they need consequences, because if they're able to understand the meaning behind it, then it can absolutely be an effective way to manage behavior. But for the kids that Janie was talking about, those consequences aren't effective if we can't understand the meaning. So I really think we have to be, cognizant of that when we're talking to kids and when we're working with kids with discipline issues or behavior issues, or we're talking to the adults that work with them, that they have to be thoughtful about the consequences. And I think we also have to think about when we instill these consequences. A lot of times we as adults sometimes wait until a student is at the tippy point of their meltdown or their explosive behavior, and then we want to talk about it. So, I mean, for those of you that maybe have a significant other or have had that type of a relationship, we have to think about, like, if you're in a big fight, is that the time to talk about changing a behavior? Even if it's something, as silly as my husband who loads the dishwasher the wrong way, according to me. And I am consistently frustrated with the way that the dishwasher is loaded, but it's never helpful for me to tell him that while he's loading the dishwasher, because then his response is always, well, you can do it, and that I don't want to do it either. But, we have to really think about that, especially with kids. And I took a training once where they drew it almost looked like a hill. So if you're talking about a kiddo climbing up a hill, when you get to the top, you have to go back down, and we need to wait until we're at the bottom of the hill again to really have that conversation. And I think in my experience, at least, I found that having those conversations when there is no bad behavior. So let's, get things stabilized, let's get everybody back on track, and then bring it up and say, hey, remember this morning at breakfast when you threw your milk on the floor, and yeah, it seems like you're a little frustrated. Like, let's talk about where that came from and what can we do next time, because do you know what happened after that? And explain the process of cleaning up the milk and how, it might have been wasteful or something like that, but it's never helpful while the milk's still on the floor to try and get them to acknowledge the behavior, because their brain is just not working right then. Ross Green calls it vapor lock when you're in that point, that nothing can get in and nothing can get out. So you're kind of just stuck where you are. So I've asked Janie if she can help us understand the neurophysiology of it all, because our brains are complex, and I think when we think about kids and what they do, we assume that there's often an easy reason why, they're doing something or not doing something. And so maybe if we can understand a little bit about how our brain functions, and especially the frontal lobe, we might understand better what it is that they're trying to tell us with their behaviors.
I will give it a try here. This is not normally how I present this, so it's a little different for me, so I'm just looking at the brain here. It's interesting. The frontal lobe is one of the later parts of the brain to develop, and a lot of times people will say, let's teach to the top, let's teach to the frontal lobe. But a lot of the kids with developmental disabilities or complex childhood trauma, the problem lies in the back part of the brain, the primitive part of the brain, which has actually been damaged because in the case of the kids with trauma, because of the toxic stress of the abuse and neglect. So the emotional regulation is part of the frontal lobe functions, but the problem really is in the primitive part of the brain that is actually kind of damaged. But these are the functions of the frontal lobe: attentional issues, how do we handle stress, and a lot of learning issues also. So one of the theories that we have is that if you bypass the primitive brain and teach to the frontal lobes, it's successful. I'm not sure that's true. I think that there has to be a lot of skill building before that happens around certainly around emotional regulation, because if emotions are not regulated properly, there's no learning going on. And you do get into that vapor lock, or the other thing that Ross Greene calls it is falling off the cliff.
Yeah.
And then you're just all about emotion. So, but this is just a little kind of a nice graphic about parts of the brain. Also, the interrelationships and the interconnectedness within the brain we're finding is very, very important, the neural connections. And again, a lot of kids have damaged neural connections that need to be rebuilt kind of from the bottom to the top. And that's a lot of what we call, that people are using the social emotional learning for, is to kind of rebuild the basic skills for kids that never really established them.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think one of the things that I always think about with the frontal lobe is that our frontal lobe really shuts down when we're stressed out. And so if we can think about all these things that our frontal lobe does, emotional regulation and paying attention, finding solutions to problems, all of those things are going to be really difficult if that part of our brain is not functioning the way that we usually want it to. Another thing that I think about is in terms of memory retrieval. A lot of times when kids are having challenging behaviors, we'll say, remember what we talked about, you need to take a deep breath, or remember we need to do this. But we have to think about how their brain is accessing that information. And a lot of times if that frontal lobe is shut down, in order for them to recall that information, they have to really work hard. And it's hard to do that when you already have a lot of other things in your brain that are going on, or when you're angry or you're feeling that stress. So I think the next time you see a kiddo that's having a behavior like that, if you can try and picture this brain, if you can try and see the brain and say, okay, this is not him being defiant, or this is not her, not complying with what it is I'm asking. This is her brain not working the way that it should be. That might help us to avoid our own stressful reactions, and I think that's also part of it too. I mean, when we're thinking about parents or educators or anyone that's working with kids, it's very easy to get stressed out, or so I've heard. And so, I think that we also have to focus on our own internal stressors and things that bother us, so that we can really be the most supportive that we can be, and we can help them to be building these skills and avoiding the types of meltdowns and explosions that we see that really negatively impact kids at home and at school. So the good news is there's lots of ways that we can help a student think through what just happened. And so we can, let's see if we push, let's try and hit the space bar.
Oh,
okay.
I see. Okay.
Well, technical difficulties. I felt a little stressed there for 1 second. I'm like, why can't anyone see this? Okay, so something as simple as providing empathy. And what I think that can sound like is just, I hear what you're saying, or, you're right, that stinks, or that would make me sad, or, just acknowledging the feeling and recognizing it. And then we talked a little bit about the antecedents before, and the other word that we use for that a lot is triggers. And so if we can see a trigger, if we can anticipate a problem, so if you know that your student has a lot of sensory issues and you're going to the circus, that might not be the best place for them, because you know that there could be a problem that comes strictly from the environment there. So we want to think about areas where there could be problems. And then, again, that whole idea of us trying to stay calm, or you or the teacher or the behaviorist or whomever is working with the child, to try and stay calm, and so that they can mirror your behaviors. Because we talk a lot about how students are really perceptive and they can feel your stress. And it's funny because one of the examples that we use is students who attend IEP meetings. And if you've ever been to an IEP meeting, it can be stressful and people seem cranky, and you walk in, it's not like a happy place. It's not a place that I would want to be invited to, you know. So we want to make sure that we're giving kids an environment that they can be successful in, and that in order to do that, we are managing our own behaviors and our own stressors so that we can be good role models for these kids. And then have an accurate interpretation. So I think sometimes as part of what we've been taught about active listening, we'll reiterate to a kid what they've said. And if you've ever done that and gotten it wrong, it makes you never want to actively listen again. Because if I say to a kid, oh, it sounds like you're frustrated, and those aren't the words they've used, the things that come back to them, back to me to tell me what the feeling actually is not as nice as frustrated. So we want to have an accurate interpretation, and we don't want to assume, you know, anything about why someone's behaving the way that they are. So that kind of leads us to thinking about taking another person's perspective, and that might be where I encourage people to really picture that brain again the next time, and to say, okay, I can only imagine what is going on in this student's brain, and to think about it from that capacity rather than, oh, what were you thinking, or why would you do that? Because if you ask a kiddo sometimes why they did something and they tell you, I don't know, it's because they don't. It's because it was a physiological response to stress, and they don't know why they did it. And now we're making them feel guilty for having that behavior or for having that feeling, even if they don't really know what caused it. And then I think if we can see the big picture, if we can see, you know, the milk spilled at breakfast as, okay, maybe breakfast is a challenging transition time. Maybe that's a hard time for this student because they have a lot of stress at school, and they know that from breakfast means the bus, and the bus means off to school, and at school it's everything that happens after that. So I think we need to kind of think about the big picture. And then also, you know, time and delay and gratification, what that means is that, I don't know about you guys, but I'm very instant gratification, which is why I love Amazon, because I order everything and it comes in 2 days. I ordered 146 rolls of toilet paper last week because it's instant gratification. It was a good deal, and so I think that we have to think about that in terms of kids. We have to think about what instant gratification looks like and why they're doing something. So if there's a behavior, if there's an action, what are they getting as feedback from that, either internally, externally? What are they getting for feedback from the adults in the room or from other kids? And think about that as a whole. And then what can we do as an alternative? So if you're feeling frustrated, if you're having this issue, what could we have done instead? And again, that's certainly not something that while a kid has a chair that's picked up in the middle of the room and they're thinking about throwing it out the window, I'm probably not going to worry as much about what he could be doing as an alternative behavior. I'm going to be thinking safety at that point. But then afterwards, it's okay, so, you know, I saw that you're frustrated, or were you frustrated? Now I'm contradicting myself. And you picked up the chair. Can you tell me about that? Why did you do that? And then what could we do instead? Is there someplace safer we could go? Is there something else? Is there something else you could pick up? And then provide an invitation to a problem-solving party. I love this phrase, the whole problem-solving party. That is a party I want to be invited to. And I teach social skills groups, and we do this all the time. So I see kiddos who stress themselves out and are so anxious about something that's going to happen before it ever even happens. You know, they're really anticipating, gosh, like they walk in and there's one truck, and there's like 5 boys, and all the boys are like, I want that truck. Or maybe they want the balloon or the ball or whatever it is. And so I see them instantly have this stressful reaction. And so I'm always looking to them to help me figure out the problem and to tell them right from the get-go, hey, you know what, don't worry about it. We're going to fix this problem, and what do you think we should do? Sometimes the answers you get are very entertaining. I think I could write a book, but at the end we find a solution to the problem, and then that really lets them know that they're safe with you and that they're confident that you're on their team. So if we go back to school, and we're thinking about how behavior and discipline impacts a child at school, we need to know who's managing these behaviors, because all the things that we just talked about, all of the strategies and skills, are only important if the people who are working with the student are also willing to do those things. So people who manage behaviors could be just about anyone, from your vice principal and your principal and the teachers and the bus drivers and those poor bus monitors who are trapped in a tin can with all kinds of behaviors. I think about them all the time. The cafeteria monitors and, all your related service people, and then your paraprofessional, which if your student has one of those, that's the person who's probably managing their day-to-day behavior the most and who's managing behaviors that no one else sees. So the idea of that paraprofessional is really for them to help the student be successful and make those transitions and do the things that we're talking about, and they need to be consistently watching for triggers and things like that. And then my question is always, is the person who's working with this student aware of the IEP and the IEP modifications or the behavior plans or things that we'll talk about a little bit, and that we need to really understand those behavioral supports so that we can make sure that the students are successful. And then we need to turn to the administrator and make sure that they are behind the student and that they're making sure that people are educated. And then how are we going to make sure that everybody who's working with them knows? So if there's a substitute teacher or if there's, a change in something, how are we going to educate them to let them know what's happening? And one of the ways that we monitor behavior and one of the ways that we figure out some of the triggers that we've talked about is through a functional behavior assessment, which we call an FBA. And what that really is a process of data collection to talk about a possible cause or function of the behavior, and then to think about the intervention to address it. So we're really trying to figure out the why before we figure out the how. So what's causing these behaviors? Can we keep track of the triggers? Can we think about how to prevent some of the behaviors rather than having to consistently go and look at consequences? And the goal of those FBAs is really for us to be able to develop a plan and to put something in place so that all of those people that we talked about who work with their students have something that they can look at and say, okay, this is the behavior plan. This is what we've figured out. This is what this child's struggling with. And this is what we should do to ensure that they're successful. And then also to be consistent, because I think we know with kids with behavior issues or trauma or kids in general, consistency is really, really important. So who can conduct an FBA? And I get this question in our call center all the time, and I think it's because it's not something that's mandated through a law. So there is no law that says such and such person has to conduct an FBA. But what it does say is that it needs to be done by someone who's been trained to directly observe and then measure behavior. And so in a lot of situations, this could be a behaviorist or a board-certified behavior analyst, a BCBA, or an ABA provider, so someone who's trained in applied behavior analysis. They're really good at the data piece of things. It could be your school psychologist or counselor. A teacher can conduct an FBA if they're a person who's knowledgeable about the behavior and who understands the process by which you observe and measure the behavior. It could be an autism consultant, which again I think would go back to that ABA person. A parent can really conduct an FBA. Usually I would say this is probably done in conjunction, so where you'll see that combination BCBA and parent. A lot of times we might be observing behaviors at school and then also observing them at home. And I hear all the time that, my kiddo doesn't do that at home. That's only a school behavior. So, okay, so let's look at what the differences are in environment and at school versus what is happening at home. So I think if your student is having an FBA, you want to just make sure that you're asking good questions about how are they going to track the data, what are we observing, what are we looking for, because in some instances there's a specific behavior that we're trying to stop or we're trying to look at, and in other instances it could be a variety of behaviors. So just really understanding what what your school is looking at as that process. And then ideally, the result of an FBA is a behavior intervention plan, so we call that a BIP. And a behavior intervention plan is really about creating a physical document that we can refer back to when we're handling a child's behavior or when we're looking at discipline. So these plans really need to be proactive, meaning that we want to try and think about what could happen or anticipate a difficulty before it ever happens. We're trying not to be so reactive to these behaviors, and a way for us to do that is to plan ahead. And then, you know, we want to educate people. We want to make sure that everybody from the gym teacher to the cafeteria monitor to whomever else is, you know, working with your student understands what's going on, and then also that the student knows what's happening. So how are they supposed to be well behaved, or how are they supposed to be appropriately behaved if they don't actually know what's expected of them? So we want to make sure that we're really clarifying that for them. And then functional. So that's where that functional comes in the FBA, the F comes from, is making sure that it's capable of serving a purpose. So we don't want to design a behavior plan that can't actually be carried out. We don't want to design a plan where the student is not at the center of it, or where we're doing things out of convenience possibly, or something like that. We really want to make sure that it's functional and accessible and something that we can use consistently. And then we want to make sure it's kind of malleable. We want to be able to update it so that we can meet the students' needs, because students' behaviors and students' needs definitely do change. And then if you're looking at the IEP and where you can find that in there, we want to look under Plet B, and you can also try and encourage your IEP team to put behavior goals in the IEP, because that's what we're using to track things. And anytime parents will call me in the call center or talk to one of our information specialists, I'm always saying, okay, let's look at Plet B of your IEP. Is there a social emotional goal in there? Is there a behavioral goal? Is there something that we're consistently working on? Because if these behaviors are impacting their ability to access the curriculum, then it's really something we need to focus on to make sure that they're getting the education that they deserve and that they need for everybody. So when it comes to where it's supported in the IEP, I kind of think it should be everywhere. So everywhere from, you know, parent concerns, that is a terrific place for you as an SESP, or if you're a parent, to really outline those concerns that you have. If there's something that you're worried about, if there's a behavior that you're trying to fix or work on at home, you want to make sure that you're putting those in the parent concerns. And then you might see behavior talked about when we look at evaluation results. Really, evaluations are us monitoring different behaviors and skills and abilities. So you'll see it in there. The student's vision, or the parent and student vision, should probably include some sort of behavioral thing, even if it's just because you want the student to be a successful adult. So if I was at a presentation a few weeks ago and they talked about thinking about students at 27. So not 7, but 27. And so how is your son or daughter or a CSP student, how are the things that we're working on? What is that going to look like when they're in their mid-20s? And if we don't figure out these behaviors now, I worry that we're not going to see them because they're going to be incarcerated, or they're going to be in a place where nobody's working on these anymore. So we're going to try and start working on them at 7, but thinking about them 20 years from then. You can also, you should be looking through your student's IEP for anywhere that that behavior is mentioned, and making sure that we're really focusing on it as a goal, and in the service delivery grid, where are we seeing that? And so I would encourage you guys to take a look at your student's IEP and just see where you're seeing behaviors mentioned. And if you're not seeing them, then maybe it's time for a quick IEP meeting. Okay, so it would be wonderful if every time we did an FBA and a BIP came out of it, that the plan worked terrifically, and now this child is super well behaved and you really don't have to do anything because you know exactly what to expect. But I think that that doesn't happen sometimes. So if that's the case, then we need to know, what can we do? What do we do when this isn't working? And the first thing we talk about is calling or drafting a letter of concerns to the school. And truthfully, I am really a proponent of sending a letter or an email. Phone calls are great if you need like a quick feedback, but unfortunately there's no way to keep records of what's talked about on those phone calls. And in the very beginning we talked a lot about data and the importance of data, and we need to be thoughtful about that when we're communicating with the school is what we need. So I would encourage you to write an email or a letter and then print that out and make sure that you're putting it in your binder or wherever it is that you're keeping the information for your student. And then as an SESP or as a parent, you can reconvene the team at any time. And so if behaviors are an issue or if the plan's not working, we really want to make sure that we're bringing the team back together and saying, hey, I'm worried, this is what's happening, or this is what isn't happening. Another thing you can do is ask for an FBA to be done by an independent evaluator. So that might mean that someone who doesn't already know the student is coming in and they're able to be a little bit more neutral and really look at just the behaviors as they're presented, opposed to having a big long history. And then you can also ask that we add a measurable goal in, so that might mean amending the IEP to change that to include a goal, but that's perfectly fine and definitely within your rights. And then you might want to ask for the data, and this I've heard can be a little bit challenging. Not every school is very free-flowing with the information, and I don't think it's that they're trying to be secretive or, not share things with you, but I think if you're going to be requesting the data, it's kind of nice to tell them that in advance and to say, hey, you know what, I'm thinking I would like to see that data, so can you just make sure that you're keeping me posted? Because some of these FBA data collections can take 45 days. When you think about how many behaviors happen in there, you don't want to wait until the 46th day to find out, that your kid's been biting someone every day. That's probably something we wanted to know on the first day, or I guess the second day, but we really don't want to wait until there's 45 days worth of things that we might not know about. And then we just review and update. So we have to think about it as a moving part. We can move it and we can do things with it, and it doesn't have to be stagnant. It doesn't have to be the same that it was yesterday. We are going to move in and talk a little bit about restraints in school. And if I can think about one of the more controversial calls that I get in the call center, it's definitely about this whole restraint process. And there are definitely regulations that are in place in schools to support making sure that there's procedures when it comes to restraints. So if we look at the state regulations, we're going to see that physical restraints can be used when non-physical interventions would not be effective, or when the student's behavior poses a threat of imminent, serious physical harm to themselves or others. So what that really means is that schools need to be trying to use other techniques before they're consistently restraining a student. And depending what the behavior looks like, there might be students who are restrained once a school year or twice a school year. There are other kids in phone calls that I've gotten where kids are restrained 2, 3, 4 times a day. And so clearly if we're restraining a kid 4 times a day, whatever the plan is for that behavior isn't working, because that certainly shouldn't be a necessity that many times during the day in the school. Where physical restraints can't be used is as a means of punishment. So if a student misbehaves, we can't, and they're not, in an escalated state where they're posing a threat, we can't just say, hey, you shouldn't have done that, and then throw a restraint hold on them. That's not the way that it's designed to be used. And as a response to property destruction, disruption of school order, refusal to comply with a school rule, or staff direction. And as I was thinking about this for today's talk, I really was a little confused by that statement, because when we talk about how students' behaviors impact people in the schools or other students or staff, that really is disruption of school order. So I was trying to think of an example that I could share. So I think, for instance, if there's a student, I think I talked about a student who's throwing chairs, which is definitely in my brain for some reason today. So if the student picks up a chair and throws it on the floor and the chair breaks into a million pieces, we can't restrain the student just for breaking the chair. If the student picks up the chair, tries to hit a teacher with it, tries to break through a window, tries to hurt another student with it, at that point we would say that it would be, acceptable through the regulations to do a physical restraint, because we're trying to keep the student and the people around them safe. So we can't be restraining people just for broken furniture, but we can if that furniture causes a threat to others. I think the same can be said for refusal to comply with a school rule or staff direction. As long as that school rule or staff direction is really about safety, then we can think about a physical restraint as a possibility. If the student simply won't line up or something like that, won't get ready to transition, won't put their backpack down, whatever it is, that wouldn't be an appropriate time for a restraint. And one of the things that is always surprising to parents when I talk to them is that parental restraint is not required for, parental consent. Parental restraint. Gosh, that would be a whole new PowerPoint. Parental consent is not required for restraint to be applied. The principal shall verbally inform the student's parent or SESP of the restraint as soon as possible, and in writing within 3 school days. So if you're an SESP or a parent of a student who's consistently restrained, I encourage you to, in the IEP, document if there's, a change that you'd like to see, because sometimes the regulations and the laws are a little bit vague. And so what does as soon as possible mean? Does that mean like after the principal finishes his lunch, or does it mean at the end of the school day, or oops, we forgot to call you and it was as soon as possible when I remembered? So if that's the case, I know a lot of families who've requested that they be called immediately, and if the principal can't call, then they have like a tree of people that calls and lets them know, or there's an email sent. Some parents have requested that any type of physical restraint be documented in writing in there, if you have like a communication book or something like that. But it's always helpful for you to go ahead and ask and make sure that those policies work for you. So in terms of school discipline, there is some new legislation that's in the process of happening. And so I think Jamie was going to talk to us a little bit about the Keeping Students Safe Act and how that would impact the code of conduct and the restraint laws and policies for our students. So,
okay, Ashley, the Tom Harkin just recently introduced on the federal level Keeping All Students Safe Act. It's a little weak in that it still will require physical restraints only in emergencies, but it also gives a little bit of backup and hopefully money for state agencies to be able to start some initiatives. So that just is in the very first phases of being put through the Senate and then the House and all those. It's out of committee, so that's a good thing. Hopefully, it will move forward in a timely way. The Massachusetts initiative is actually a little bit older, and that is coming to fruition even as we speak. The Massachusetts Advocates for Children is very much in favor of this act because it is promoting their initiative of safe and supportive schools and flexible frameworks and things like that. So we are actually going to this afternoon to the Massachusetts Advocates for Children to find out how organizations like the Federation can be proactive in getting this passed soon. So those are the new things for school discipline, and one of the more onerous things in school discipline, of course, is physical restraints. The Act relative to safe and supportive schools also talks about seclusion, which is another thing that's very tough on kids, especially kids with trauma issues. So Massachusetts is a little bit more progressive as far as what they're asking to be passed in the legislature, but at least the feds have taken some action at this point in time.
I am headed to Washington, D.C. for the Disability Policy Conference in April, and I have talked with a lot of different local organizations about their legislative priorities, and I have seen safe and supportive schools on all of them, which I think tells me that it's really important to the populations that we serve. And what I'm learning as I'm preparing for my trip to D.C. is that as members of the community, we do a lot to make sure that legislation that's important to us gets heard. And so it's good for you to know, who your reps are and all that, and make sure that they are all supporting this and that they're encouraging others to support it too. So you can always take a look on the Mass Legislature website and make sure that your local folks are advocating for the same things that are important to you and your students and your family. So, we're kind of headed back to school and figuring out how behavior is managed at your student's school. So a lot of times one of the difficult things for me when I'm in the call center and someone's calling about behavior is understanding this whole idea that at some schools if you do this, it's, you miss, recess or something like that. At another school you do it and you're suspended for 10 days. So that consistency or lack thereof is something that you might also see change with some of the new legislation if we're talking about safe and supportive schools, is that I'm hoping that there might be a little bit more clarity. And I don't know that for sure, but it's definitely something that would help me in the call center for sure. For instance, this morning I got a call from a mom who said that her son had thrown a chair, so that must be where it's coming from today. And the first time he did it, it was kind of like, okay, don't do that again, and nobody even told mom. And then the second time he was suspended for 10 days. So we will talk about suspensions and length thereof right after this when we talk about manifestation determinations. But it really shows you that even in the same school with the same kiddo, a behavior one day can have a very different consequence the next. So that's why it's important. If you're looking at your school code of conduct, there should be a pretty clear outline of if you do something, what will happen. And that's where, as the SESP or as the parent, you really want to look at it and say, okay, if my kid throws a chair, which is pretty possible, and that happens, 2 or 3 times a week, we can't be suspending them for 10 days every time. What can we do instead? So how are we going to make this code of conduct? How are we going to make this rule or discipline work for my student? So you'll see that they talk a little bit about in-school suspension sometimes, which means that you're taken out of your usual class and you might sit in the principal's office, or some schools have an in-house suspension room or a designated area. But I think that also brings up a little bit about what Janie talked about seclusion, is this whole idea that we're taking these kids out and then we can't put them in a room all by themselves and expect that they're going to be accessing the curriculum that way. And then there's also an idea of an out-of-school suspension, meaning that's when they're going home, or an emergency suspension where when they don't quite know what to do with the student's behaviors, they're suspended until they can figure it out. So that brings me to talking about IEP placement, and if a suspension is more than 10 consecutive days or 10 cumulative days. So I'm going to say that one more time because it's really important. So if you're suspended 2 days in September and then 5 days in October and then 4 days after Christmas, anytime it equals 10 days, it's considered a change in placement and there has to be a manifestation determination. So what's a manifestation determination? So under IDEA, which is the federal law, it's an ITP team meeting that has to be held within 10 days of any change in placement of a student with a disability because of a violation of the student code of conduct. So one of the things that's important to note there is that this is only for students with disabilities. So if your student is not on an IEP and happens to be suspended for more than 10 days, it does not constitute a change in placement because it's not a regular education law. So you really want to make sure that if your student's on an IEP, that you're keeping track of those days. And the mom that I talked to this morning, we had to advise her to call the school and ask for a record of suspension days because she had no idea. She's like, I don't know. I mean, I feel like he's never in school. So realistically, she's probably had exceeded that 10-day mark before, but as a parent and, not knowing the law the way that we do, she didn't know that she should be expecting this determination. So parents are definitely part of that process, and they need to receive notice of the manifestation determination at the same time the decision to suspend is made. So if the school says, this afternoon, okay, we're suspending him for 10 days, they also need to say we're suspending him for such and such days, and we're having a manifestation determination. And then at that meeting, the IEP team members are going to review the incident that led to the most recent school exclusion. So if the student was suspended for throwing a chair, let's say, we're talking about that specific incident. And then we're going to look at all of their information, their IEP, teacher observation, relevant information provided by parent, which is why I want people to keep good track of, progress reports and information sent home, and then evaluations and assessments. And then you have to think about who's going to be at the team meeting. So obviously members from the school, and then the parent or the SESP, and that's really, really important because the burden of proof at a manifestation meeting is on the parent or SESP. So you're trying to prove that the student's behavior is a result of their disability. So you want to make sure you're at that, and then also relevant members of the IEP team, and so you can also have feedback in that. So you can say who you think should be there. And then the manifestation determination really just asks two questions. Was the student's behavior caused by or directly related to the disability, and was it a result of the school's failure to implement the IEP? So if yes, then the student can go back to their original educational setting. The school, if they haven't already, may do an FBA and a BIP, or they might make modifications to the IEP to include new goals or behavior plans. But if no, then the student can be disciplined in the same manner and for the same duration as students without disabilities. The student will receive FAPE, which is a free and appropriate public education, and that's under a special education law as well, federal law, to continue in general ed curriculum and towards the IEP meeting goal, even if they're in a different setting. So that different setting could be at home if the student can't be in the school. It could be in one of the 45-day placements that I mentioned at the beginning. It could be in a therapeutic environment or a residential school. And then following a disciplinary action, the student will be returned to the classroom unless the parent or SESP and school agree to something else, or the child's lawfully expelled. So that is tricky. So the expulsion is another question that luckily I don't get very, very often, but yes, schools can expel a student even if they are on an IEP if it's proved that the student's disability had nothing to do with the behavior, or if they have one of those 3 deadly sins we talked about before, so drugs, weapons, and assault. So I mentioned quickly that the burden of proof is definitely on the parents, and they need to make sure you're kind of thinking about it as if you were a witness in a court case, and how are you going to make your own testimony and say this is what happened, this is why. And at the bottom of this you'll see a link to a discipline flow chart, which I use all the time. Probably too frequently, to be honest with you, but if you have access to that, I would definitely encourage you to click the link and see if it download it for you, or you can even Google discipline flow chart and it'll come up for you. So when don't we need a manifestation meeting? If the student brings weapons, drugs, or does serious bodily harm to someone. So those are situations in which the safety of others is really put ahead of, manifestation determination in the disability. So they can be sent to an interim alternative education setting for up to 45 days without a manifestation meeting, which actually is exactly what happened in the conversation I had with Mom this morning, is that because of the behavior, and I think the chair must have hurt someone. So what I'm thinking is that Mom said I didn't consent to this new placement, and she didn't have to because the school is putting the safety of others first. So there's a lot of research out there about discipline and its impact on students, and really we've found that suspensions can lead to more discipline issues. There's significant loss of time and learning. There's a relationship between suspensions and school dropouts, and also between suspensions and achievement gaps. And I think the interesting thing about suspensions, and it's something I never understood even as a student, is like, okay, this kid doesn't want to go to school, so let's send him home. I always felt like with a suspension you should have to like stay at school longer, because a lot of kids find that they know the cause and effect of their behavior. So, I really don't want to be here, so I think I'll throw that chair. And what do you know? I'm home, and I'm on the couch. And then I'm concerned at that point about who's supervising these kids at home. People work. So, the Department of Elementary and Secondary Education, which is DESE up there, they do the best they can to really encourage schools to provide appropriate alternative structured learning. So that's where we might talk about alternative high schools, or therapeutic 766, which is a private school, or some sort of setting where the student can actually stay in school and be part of the community and still be learning. And then they're trying to prevent student disciplinary removals from happening, so suspensions or expulsions. And then there's a document that you can access to, and we found it just by Googling, the self-assessment inventory. And so that's going to help us look at procedures and make sure that schools are following the rules too. So there's also due process if you disagree with the manifestation determination, and so you'd want to go through the Bureau of Special Education Appeals, and you can do that by requesting a hearing. And the reasons for appeal are there, if you don't think that that they should go to an alternative placement, if you think that the manifestation determination was inaccurate, if you don't think that the removal is a change in placement, if you don't think the student's receiving educational services as a discipline, or if you disagree with the functional behavior assessment. A school district that believes maintaining the student's current placement is substantially likely to result in injury or others, they can also request a hearing through the BSEA. But just know that at hearing, most people are represented by attorneys, and a hearing can be a lengthy and expensive process. So you really that's why you want to be up on what's happening before it gets to that point. And then during the appeal process, that student can stay in the disciplinary placement, which could mean that they're at home if that's what they've determined, or they can go back to the school while an appeal is pending, or they can go back to their original placement depending on the time period surrounding it. So we would definitely recommend that you request an expedited hearing on that for sure. And then at the BSEA, there's a bunch of options that you can use in terms of mediation and a resolution meeting, pre-hearing, and then hearing and SpedEx. So one of the things we really talk about is trying to do everything you can before it comes to going to hearing. And if you have questions about that, you can always give us a call here in the call center. Really quickly, because I realize that I must be pretty chatty today. Discipline is exciting for me. We just want to give you some quick updates on Mass Chapter 222, which is effective July of 2014. And what it will require schools to do is revise their code of conduct. And Boston Public Schools actually went above and beyond and has already implemented Chapter 222. So right now those regulations are online and you can look at them. And there's also an opportunity for public comment through March 7th. So you can take a look at the DESE website and look at that if you feel very strongly and you have comments that you want to make about the regulations. And then ideally, final action by the Board of Elementary and Secondary Education is anticipated on March 25th, so in just a few weeks. And it would really make a lot of changes in terms of the code of conduct for all of our students in their schools. So what do we know? What did we learn besides that kiddo is super cute? when kids feel right, they behave right. So I've read that book a long time ago about how to talk so kids could listen and listen so kids will talk. And I think what we're trying to say is just that kiddos who feel supported or who know that you're on their side or who know that you understand that their behaviors are not intended just to make you angry, often do better. So if they're feeling good, if they're feeling supported, their behavior is going to reflect that. If they're feeling unsupported or angry or anything, then you're also going to see that in their behavior. So the final words for you guys, some things to think about are to really make sure you read your school handbook. And I know that people are very busy, and I'm sure it's not what you plan to spend, your weekend doing is going over the code of conduct for your student, but I definitely would encourage you to maybe print out a copy, and next time you have a few minutes, just kind of go through it and see how it can help your student. And then look at that IEP, and if you're in the process of writing a new IEP, make sure that we're talking about how to avoid discipline issues. Sometimes if our kids have discipline issues, it could be tricky to maintain healthy relationships with the school, but I think the more collaborative you can be, the more of a team you can be for your student, the better the outcomes. And then just making sure that people understand the student's needs through effective communication and knowing about educating yourself about safe and supportive schools and the changes in 222. So, are we going to do questions? Okay. So I hope you guys are still hanging in there. But we're happy to take a couple of questions and see, how we can help you understand the discipline process a little better.
Okay, can you hear me? Great. So this is Emily here, and I'm going to read a few of the questions we've gotten. Is there a law that prevents and/or allows schools from taking away recess time and lunchtime as discipline?
So there isn't a specific law that outlines recess or lunchtime. However, one of the things that I always talk about is for students who have social goals on their IEP, you can certainly argue that those are the most social times of the day and that taking it away would be inappropriate for working towards their goals. The other piece of it when we think about lunch and recess is we have to factor in how the behavior does the punishment fit the crime. So if the kiddo is having, bad behaviors in the classroom and is fidgety and whatever, is it really appropriate to take away the time that they're going to get to go burn that all off? So even though there's not a law, there's certainly ways for you to broach that topic with the school and to say, I feel like with my student's disability or with their behaviors, this isn't an appropriate consequence, and he or she isn't able to understand how one relates to the other. So I think that would be my suggestion. But unfortunately, no. I wish there was a law that said everybody needs recess. I wish there was one that said I could have recess.
How about do partial days count towards the 10 days in a manifestation?
They sure do. So that's something important to think about too. So if your student is suspended at 10 a.m. every day, that is, every time that's still counts towards it. So that's why you want to maintain really good records of how many days and even hours in that point, because you could add it up to be a full school day.
Okay. Are students on a 504 entitled to a manifestation hearing?
They are not. 504 is not a special education law. It unfortunately doesn't. Only students who are covered under IDEA, so it would be students who are eligible for an IEP. But I would say that if you have a student who's on a 504 plan who has some pretty severe behaviors, it might not be a bad idea to go back to the school team and see if those behaviors constitute them qualifying for related services, and related services will help you to get an IEP.
I just want to add to that, Ashley, that there is a law, an IDEA regulation that talks about child find. So if there's a pattern of behavior that a parent, again, this is kind of unlikely to be the person that is in charge of making sure the school knows this. But the school is also supposed to be watching for patterns. And if the pattern is occurring, then that's a reason to put up an IEP.
Okay, next question here. Where can I access the disciplinary removals self-assessment inventory?
So it's interesting. We hyperlinked it into the presentation in the hopes that when it gets sent out, or if it's already been sent out, that you can click it. If that doesn't work, then all we did was go right into the Google search bar and put the words in exactly as it's in there, and it will pop right up. It actually opens up in a Word document. And we were looking at it today and yesterday, and I think that although it's intended for schools, it also could be really helpful for parents to track, or SESPs to track their own discipline challenges, or to keep track of those days of suspension and things like that.
And again, to add to Chapter 222, one of the big parts of Chapter 222 is much better data collection, that will, I think, not be, this is discretionary now, that the inventory after July 2014, that's no longer discretionary. That would be part of the law.
Right, and it will also, it's not just the data collection, but also the data reporting.
Yeah.
Okay, just a hypothetical. If a child in a class has behavior issues and the entire class is punished as a result of that, what can I do about this?
Okay, well, here's the thing on that is that sometimes you hear things that go against the law, and sometimes you hear things that are just not effective teaching strategies. And so I don't think there's anything wrong with calling a meeting, with members in charge of discipline and saying, hey, I'm really concerned that kids are being disciplined for something that isn't their fault or something like that. So really bringing up the whole science behind consequences and things like that can prove helpful. And I think there's lots and lots of research to support that those are not effective behavior management techniques. And especially if there's kids in that class that have an IEP and they're working towards goals, or if your student is one of those students, I would really make sure that it doesn't conflict with whatever their goals and objectives are in their IEP.
We have a statement here that you could confirm. Suspension of the bus is also included in suspension time. Is that correct?
Yes. Well, so if you're suspended from school, like if you cannot go to school, then yes, you also can't ride the bus, but I'm not sure where you would ride the bus to if you weren't going to school. If you're having in-school suspension, most of the time the student is able to take the transportation unless the behavior occurred on the transportation. So if a kiddo's had an issue on the bus, they can be suspended from the bus. You do want to just make sure that if your student receives specialized transportation, if that's part of their IEP, then that would be a great thing to talk about in terms of the code of conduct, because it will highlight, incidences on the bus and things like that. And if your child receives transportation or is out of district or something like that, that would be a great thing to put in there in the IEP.
I don't think, though, Ashley, that the time that you're suspended off the bus adds up. That's not part of the accumulating time.
No, because it's really learning time. So the time that you're on the bus, like if we're thinking about the school day and the fact that we need 180 school days, the travel time is not included.
Yeah.
So it wouldn't be. But
interestingly, though, a lot of times when a kid is suspended off the bus, they don't get to school because the parents can't get them there.
Right.
So, but even that, I don't think is. That's a good point to make, though.
Well, I think that's something you can make in the IEP is the importance of the transportation and the fact that they can't access the curriculum without the transportation.
Right.
So if they're not being suspended from the curriculum, and that's what they need to be able to actually get there, then we would want to argue that as part of the IEP.
So we have some other great questions that are longer, but I think they merit some more involved answers, so I think you might want to follow up with some folks afterward.
Yeah, and I can certainly do that, and also I'm in the call center myself 3 days a week, Monday, days am I there? Monday, Tuesday, and Thursday. So you can certainly call and talk to me, but we have great information specialists that are in there every day from 9 to 3, and you can always call and leave a message or call and try and connect with one of us. And you can also send an email, so you can send an email to info@scsn.org, which goes to the operator, and she'll get it out to us. Or if you have a specific question about something that we talked about today, I'm happy to have you email me. And my email address is acoates, COATES@scsn.org, and I'm happy to try and get back to you and answer some of those more student-specific questions.
Great.
Okay.
Okay, thanks everybody, and we will be talking with you again next month. Alrighty? Bye-bye now.
Thanks.
Thank you.